Hello and welcome. Tonight we're traveling back to a day that changed the course of the 20th century, when stormy seas and steel-grey skies bore witness to the largest amphibious invasion in human history. This is the story of D-Day, how it was planned, where it unfolded, and the quiet bravery of those who stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. So if you're ready to unwind, settle in, and let your mind wander through the courage and chaos of June 6th, 1944, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey through the past. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Road to War. Seeds of a Global Conflict. Before the storm of war returned to Europe, before soldiers crept through hedgerows and planes filled the morning sky, the world was already unraveling. The story of D-Day begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but decades earlier, in the ruins of another war that promised peace but delivered only pause. The First World War ended in the fall of 1918. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But even as soldiers laid down their arms and civilians breathed sighs of weary relief, few could have imagined that this supposed war to end all wars was only a prologue. The peace that followed was uneasy, complicated, and fragile. In cities across Europe, bells rang to mark the end of the bloodshed, but the cost was impossible to forget. Millions were dead. Entire towns had vanished beneath artillery fire. Fields were poisoned by gas and scattered with barbed wire. And while some nations celebrated, others mourned not only their losses, but their futures. Germany, in particular, found itself at the center of this broken peace. Crushed beneath the weight of the Treaty of Versailles, it was blamed for the war and forced to accept terms that left deep scars. The treaty, signed in the summer of 1919, stripped Germany of valuable territory, limited its military to a fraction of its former strength, and demanded enormous financial reparations. Payments so vast they crushed an already fragile economy. The humiliation ran deep. Many Germans believed they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by politicians and diplomats. They called it the stab in the back. Veterans returned home to find poverty, hunger, and hopelessness. In the years that followed, German currency collapsed. Inflation soared so wildly that a loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow of cash. Families watched their savings vanish overnight. Out of this desperation, dangerous ideas began to grow. In the early 1920s, a failed artist and former soldier named Adolf Hitler began to rise within the chaos. He joined a fringe political group in Munich, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, later known simply as the Nazis. His speeches were fiery and filled with blame. He pointed fingers at Jews, communists, foreign powers, and the leaders of the Weimar Republic. He promised strength. He promised pride. And people, broken by hardship, began to listen. In 1923, Hitler attempted a coup in Munich. It failed, and he was imprisoned. But even in prison, his ideas spread. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, laying out his vision for Germany's future. It was a blueprint for dictatorship, racism, and war. Throughout the 1920s, the world tried to recover. The United States experienced a boom in industry and culture. Europe struggled but endured. But in 1929, everything changed again. The stock market in New York crashed and the Great Depression began. Banks failed. Jobs disappeared. Across the globe, economies spiraled into collapse. The pain was not limited to one country. It was worldwide. And once again, in their suffering, people turned to strongmen who promised certainty in uncertain times. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already shown the way. He had marched on Rome in 1922 and built a fascist regime, a government that glorified power, rejected democracy, and punished dissent. Italy became a one-party state where opponents were silenced and the press controlled. Mussolini promised to make Italy great again, evoking the glory of the ancient Roman Empire, and he dreamed of conquest and expansion. In Germany, Hitler watched and learned. When the Depression reached German shores, the Nazi Party surged. They promised jobs. They promised order. They promised revenge. In January of 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. Within months, he dismantled Germany's democracy, abolished political opposition, and declared himself Führer, the supreme leader of a new Nazi Germany. The transformation was swift and chilling. Books were burned. Jews were boycotted. Secret police filled the streets. And Hitler began rearming the country in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The world watched, concerned but hesitant to act. Memories of the First World War made nations like Britain and France fearful of confrontation. They chose a policy of appeasement, hoping that if they gave Hitler what he wanted, he might stop. He did not stop. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, a region it had been forbidden to militarize. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. Later that year, he set his sights on the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with many German-speaking people. At a conference in Munich, Britain and France agreed to let him take it, hoping, once again, to avoid war. But peace was an illusion. In March of 1939, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. That summer, he struck a shocking deal with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. And then, on the first day of September in the year 1939, German troops crossed into Poland. The Second World War had begun. Britain and France, now unable to ignore Hitler's aggression, declared war. But they were not ready. Poland fell quickly, crushed by German blitzkrieg, a new form of lightning warfare that combined fast-moving tanks, planes, and infantry. 17 days after Germany's invasion, Soviet forces moved into eastern Poland, taking their share as agreed. The following year, in the spring of 1940, Hitler turned west. Denmark and Norway were taken. Then, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In June, France fell. Paris was occupied. The French government surrendered. In less than a year, most of Western Europe was under Nazi control. Only Britain stood free. Led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Britain braced for invasion. The German Air Force launched a relentless bombing campaign known as the Blitz, but the Royal Air Force held firm. In the skies over Britain, young pilots fought desperate battles to protect their homeland, and for a time, the invasion of the British Isles was postponed. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States watched with growing concern. Though officially neutral, America began supporting Britain through programs like Lend-Lease, providing weapons and supplies. But the American people were weary of war. It had taken so many lives just 2 decades before. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Battleships burned. Sailors died. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The war was now truly global. In North Africa, deserts became battlegrounds. In the Pacific, island after island erupted in fire. On the Eastern Front, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, a campaign that would become one of the deadliest in human history. And yet, across all these shifting fronts and terrible losses, one idea began to take root among the Allies: liberation. The war could not be won from the skies alone. To free Europe from Hitler's grasp, a land invasion would be necessary. Troops would have to return to the continent, to fight, to bleed, and to take back what had been stolen. The planning began in secret. The leaders of the Allied nations, Roosevelt, Churchill, and later Stalin, met in conferences across the globe, in Casablanca, in Tehran. They agreed on a strategy to open a Western front. The Soviets, bearing the brunt of the German war machine, demanded it, and the people of occupied Europe prayed for it. But the task was enormous. To land on enemy shores meant facing bunkers, barbed wire, mines and machine guns. It meant building an army so vast, so well trained, and so coordinated that it could strike with precision and force. It meant controlling the seas, the skies, and the stories, using deception to hide where the blow would fall. The date of that blow would become known to the world as D-Day. But before that morning came, before the boats launched, the gliders flew, and the beaches turned red, there were years of pain, struggle, and resistance. Years of hope flickering in the darkness. This is where the story begins. Not just with armies and generals, but with people, with shopkeepers in occupied villages, with children hiding during air raids, with resistance fighters sending coded messages by candlelight, with factory workers in America loading crates of supplies, with pilots preparing for one-way missions, with leaders weighing impossible choices, with an entire world waiting for a turning point. D-Day would be that turning point. But first, the world had to survive the gathering storm. Chapter 2: Occupied Europe and the Urgency for Liberation. The guns that fell silent in the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, did not bring peace, only a grim stillness. Across the continent of Europe, as the dust settled and new borders were drawn by force, life entered a strange, heavy pause. But it was not quiet. Not really. In the silence, boots marched on cobblestones. Radios crackled with propaganda. Windows dimmed at night under curfews. And whispers replaced open conversation. Europe was occupied. For those who lived through it, the occupation was not just political or military. It was personal. It invaded homes, thoughts, routines. It changed how people greeted each other on the street, how they looked at strangers, and how they slept at night, if they slept at all. In France, it happened almost overnight. One moment, there were French flags over government buildings, and the next, the swastika. French soldiers, outmatched and outmaneuvered, surrendered in shock. Paris, the city of light, was taken without a battle. Its people stood in stunned silence as German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées, boots clicking in unison. It was not a scene of fire and chaos, but something colder, more haunting. A civilization watching its freedom slip quietly through its fingers. To the north, Belgium and the Netherlands had already fallen. Norway was under occupation, Denmark too. Germany's reach now stretched from the icy edges of Scandinavia to the warm shores of the Mediterranean. Spain, under the rule of Franco, remained officially neutral but sympathetic. Italy stood beside Germany as a proud member of the Axis. And in the east, the Soviet Union had not yet been drawn fully into the fight. That would come soon, and with a terrible cost. In the western part of the continent, the new daily life was governed not by elected leaders, but by German officers and collaborators. Streets were patrolled by soldiers who spoke another language. Train stations became places of fear, not travel. Churches and schools were watched closely. Young men were taken for labor. Farmers were told what to grow and where to send it. Anyone who spoke out too loudly, or helped the wrong person, or was simply unlucky, could vanish without a trace. Even the air felt different. But perhaps the most terrifying change of all was what began to happen to Europe's Jewish communities. Laws had already been passed, names registered, businesses marked. Now, entire neighborhoods were being emptied. At first, people whispered about relocations. They saw neighbors forced into trucks and trains, told they were being moved to work camps. But as the months passed, the truth became harder to ignore. The Holocaust had begun, and in the silence of occupied cities, many knew it, even if they could not say it out loud. And yet, even in this darkness, sparks of resistance began to glow. Across the continent, in basements, back rooms, and forests, ordinary people began to push back, not with armies or tanks, but with paper, wire, and silence. In the Netherlands, young women smuggled messages on bicycles. In Poland, entire underground schools were created to teach children what the Nazis forbade. In France, the resistance began as little more than words, leaflets, graffiti, forbidden radio broadcasts. But it grew, steadily and bravely. There were no uniforms, no medals, only courage. In Greece, partisans blew up railways. In Norway, resistance fighters sank a Nazi ship carrying heavy water, sabotaging Hitler's nuclear ambitions. In Yugoslavia, communist and nationalist forces alike waged full-scale guerrilla war. In Czechoslovakia, two brave men carried out Operation Anthropoid, assassinating Reinhard Heydrich, one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials. Their mission cost them their lives and led to brutal reprisals. But it also proved that the occupation was not complete. The spirit of freedom had not been extinguished. Resistance was dangerous. It meant torture, imprisonment, execution. Whole villages were burned in retaliation for a single act of defiance. Families disappeared overnight, and yet still people resisted. Not for glory, but because they could not live with silence. In London, the free governments of occupied nations gathered in exile. Polish officers, Czech leaders, French officials who had escaped before their countries fell. They all met under the Union Jack, working with British intelligence, planning for the day they might return home. Some coordinated resistance. Others prepared soldiers. Some simply waited, desperate to be useful again. And above them, a new alliance was forming. The United States, having joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, now stood firmly alongside Britain. The Soviet Union, after being invaded by Germany in the summer of 1941, had become the third member of the Allied powers. And while the Allies fought fierce battles in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, they all knew that true victory in Europe would only come through liberation, the act of freeing the occupied countries, of returning them to their people. But liberation would not come easily. The English Channel separated Britain from France, a narrow stretch of water, but a world away in terms of risk. Any invasion across those waters would be met with fierce resistance. The German army had fortified the coastline, building bunkers, laying mines, stretching barbed wire, and stationing elite troops. Hitler called it the Atlantic Wall, and he believed it to be impenetrable. To break through would require more than ships and guns. It would require coordination on a scale never before attempted. It would require secrecy, surprise, and a kind of bravery that only comes from knowing that failure means more than just defeat. It means losing the world. By the end of 1943, the Allied leaders had made their decision. There would be a cross-channel invasion. It would begin in Normandy, and it would change everything. The people of occupied Europe did not know the date, but they felt the pressure building. Air raids became more frequent. Supplies dropped into the countryside. Messages crackled over radios, some in code, some in song. Resistance fighters were told to prepare. Bridges would need to be destroyed, railways sabotaged, communication lines cut. It would not be easy. It would not be safe. But help was coming. And when it came, the future of the continent would hang in the balance. Chapter 3: Forging an Alliance. The birth of Operation Overlord. War has a way of testing not only armies, but friendships, of pushing nations to their limits, not just on the battlefield, but in rooms filled with maps, ashtrays, and the weight of responsibility. By the end of 1943, the Allies knew the time had come. Words and promises would no longer be enough. The time for action, real, terrifying, irreversible action was now. And so, across the Atlantic and in the halls of London and Washington, the work began. The alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had always been a fragile one. These were nations with different histories, different politics, and different visions of the world to come. Britain, still led by the indomitable Winston Churchill, held tightly to its empire and traditions. The Soviet Union, ruled by Joseph Stalin with an iron fist, had suffered beyond measure on the Eastern Front and demanded immediate relief. And the United States, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was powerful, distant, and newly blooded, full of energy, resources, and a growing sense of responsibility. Yet despite their differences, they were bound together by necessity. Nazi Germany had to be defeated, and they all knew it would take more than defense, more than bombing raids, and more than hope. It would take boots on the ground, in France, in the heart of occupied Europe. But how do you invade a fortress? That was the question. From the earliest days of the war, Churchill had been cautious. He favoured indirect attacks, campaigns in North Africa, bombing runs over German cities, pressure through economic warfare, and naval blockades. But Stalin was running out of patience. His Red Army was bleeding every day on the Eastern Front. Millions had already died. He demanded that the Allies open a second front in the West to divide German forces and give the Soviets room to breathe. Roosevelt agreed, and in late 1943, at the Tehran Conference in Iran, the decision was made. There would be an invasion of France. It would be led primarily by the United States and Britain. It would land on the northern coast, in Normandy, and it would happen as soon as possible, ideally by the spring of the next year. The operation was given a name, Operation Overlord. But giving it a name was the easy part. What followed was perhaps the most complex and ambitious military planning effort in the history of the world. Hundreds of thousands of troops would be involved, dozens of nations, tens of thousands of vehicles, aircraft, boats, and supplies. And every last detail, every rifle, every meal, every map, every signal would have to be planned, coordinated, and executed in perfect silence. The supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was chosen carefully. The man selected was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a calm, steady leader from Kansas who had a gift for diplomacy and clarity under pressure. He was not the loudest man in the room, but he was the most respected. And now, the weight of the entire invasion rested on his shoulders. Working alongside Eisenhower were British generals like Bernard Montgomery, American planners like Omar Bradley, and a vast network of intelligence officers, engineers, and specialists. Together, they mapped out the invasion in layers. Each beach, each drop zone, each hour of the day. There would be 5 landing sites, each with its own code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Americans would take Utah and Omaha. The British would take Gold and Sword. The Canadians would take Juno. But before the troops could land, there had to be preparation, immense, careful, and secretive. Factories in Britain and the United States ramped up production of tanks, boats, gliders, and uniforms. Training camps across the English countryside filled with soldiers rehearsing beach landings, parachute jumps, and night marches. Engineers designed new vehicles, amphibious tanks, floating bridges, and landing craft that could spill soldiers onto sand under fire. Intelligence teams studied the French coast in astonishing detail. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions. Resistance fighters sent back reports from Normandy. Even holiday postcards from before the war were used to understand the landscape. And all the while, the greatest challenge of all loomed overhead: secrecy. If the Germans discovered where and when the invasion would happen, it could be a disaster. The beaches would be fortified, reinforcements would arrive, and the entire effort might collapse on the shore, ending in blood and failure. So the Allies launched a deception campaign, one of the most brilliant and elaborate in history. It was called Operation Bodyguard, and it was designed to make the Germans believe the invasion would come elsewhere, perhaps at Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To support the lie, they built fake armies. Inflatable tanks were scattered across fields. Wooden airplanes stood on mock runways. Radio traffic buzzed with false commands. Even a fake general, George Patton, was assigned to lead the pretend army, because the Germans believed he was too important to be left out. It worked. By early 1944, German commanders remained convinced that any attack on Normandy would be a diversion, a smaller strike, not the main blow. Meanwhile, in small villages across England, the real troops waited. American GIs and British Tommies lived side by side in temporary camps. They played cards, wrote letters, practiced drills. They waited for orders, for good weather, and for fate to call their name. In the final weeks before the invasion, secrecy tightened. Soldiers were confined to their bases. Letters home were censored. Maps were locked away. And every man who was going to cross the Channel carried a growing awareness of what lay ahead. Not just a battle, but a moment that would define the century. The planning was done. The pieces were in place. All that remained was the right weather, the right tide, and the courage to launch. The world held its breath, and soon the storm would begin. Chapter 4: Secrets and Shadows. The Deception Campaigns. Long before a single soldier touched the shores of Normandy, the first shots of Operation Overlord were fired in the shadows. These were not blasts from rifles or cannons, but quiet, careful moves made in smoke-filled rooms, beneath radio towers, inside locked offices, and through coded whispers carried across enemy lines. The invasion of Europe would not succeed through strength alone. It would require something just as powerful: misdirection. And so, before the Allies crossed the Channel, they set out to create the greatest illusion the modern world had ever seen. This illusion had a name: Operation Bodyguard. Its purpose was simple in theory, but monumental in execution: to convince Adolf Hitler and the German High Command that the invasion would not happen in Normandy, but somewhere else entirely. If the deception worked, the Germans would be unprepared. If it failed, the entire Allied force could be destroyed before it gained a foothold in France. To fool the enemy, the Allies needed more than clever maps or coded messages. They needed theatre, a full production staged across countries, using every trick of espionage, performance, and psychology they had. One of the key acts in this deception was called Operation Fortitude. It was divided into two parts, Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North was designed to suggest an Allied invasion of Norway. Dummy radio signals were sent, false orders given, and entire phantom units were stationed in Scotland. The hope was to keep German troops tied down in the far north, guarding icy shores where no attack would ever come. But Fortitude South was the true masterpiece. Its goal was to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, just across from the White Cliffs of Dover. This was, logically, the most obvious place to attack. It was closest, it had deep water ports, and the terrain beyond the beaches was easier to move through. To sell the lie, the Allies created the first United States Army Group, or at least the idea of it. This army did not exist in any meaningful way. It had no real divisions, no real tanks, no real soldiers, but to the Germans, it looked very real. From the air, it looked like a mighty force, fields filled with tanks, artillery, and landing craft. But these were made of rubber, wood, and cloth, inflatable and hollow. Dummy aircraft sat on airstrips. Trucks moved in circles to mimic the patterns of army traffic. On the radio, operators sent streams of fake transmissions, messages about supplies, troop movements, drills. Even intercepted conversations between officers discussed plans in detail, just believable enough to sound genuine. And perhaps the most brilliant part of all was the man chosen to command this imaginary army, General George S. Patton. Patton was one of the most aggressive and recognizable figures in the Allied ranks. Loud, charismatic, and unpredictable, he had led troops in North Africa and Sicily. The Germans respected and feared him. They believed he would lead the main attack. So the Allies put him in Dover, gave him a fake army, and let him play his part. But deception did not stop with fake tanks and false orders. It reached deeper, into the very heart of German intelligence. Throughout the war, the Allies had captured or turned nearly every German spy operating in Britain. These double agents were used to feed misinformation back to Berlin. They were codenamed and carefully managed, each one playing a unique role in the theatre of deception. There was Agent Garbo, a Spanish man who had built an entire network of imaginary subagents across the British Isles. He reported regularly to the Germans, providing a mix of accurate and false information. His messages were so detailed, so believable, that German commanders trusted him completely. They even awarded him the Iron Cross, unaware that he was working for British intelligence the entire time. Together, these agents painted a false picture, that the real invasion would come at Calais, and that any landings elsewhere were merely a distraction. The Germans believed it, even as paratroopers began dropping into Normandy, even as landing craft pushed toward the beaches. The German High Command held back key reinforcements, convinced the real attack was still to come. For days after D-Day, Hitler refused to shift his best divisions from Calais to Normandy. He was certain the main strike was still ahead. That delay, those precious hours and days, saved lives. It allowed the Allies to gain ground, bring in more troops, and begin the slow, bloody push inland. All because of shadows. because of silence, because of a grand illusion built not with gunpowder, but with theatre, radio waves, and imagination. Operation Bodyguard was not perfect. Some German commanders suspected Normandy might be a target, but the scale and success of the deception was unmatched. It was a victory of the mind, one that shaped the battlefield before the first bullet was ever fired. And as the Allies stood ready to begin the invasion, they carried with them more than weapons. They carried the power of secrecy, the element of surprise, and the hopes of millions.
The stage was set!
The enemy was watching the wrong coast, and the real storm was just beginning to rise. Chapter 5. Preparing for Invasion. Training, Maps, and Storms. While the German commanders looked toward Calais and waited for a strike that would never come, across the English countryside, the real invasion force was gathering. In forests, in fields, in coastal towns, and makeshift camps. The men who would soon change the course of history were waiting and preparing. They had come from many places, from the wide plains of Canada, from small American towns with single traffic lights, from farms in the English countryside and cities scarred by air raids. They were young, many barely 20 years old, and older too, veterans of earlier battles. They were volunteers and conscripts, soldiers and engineers, medics and radio men. Some had never left their hometowns before crossing the ocean. Others had already fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in the skies over Europe. Now they were all part of one vast force. They trained by day and sometimes by night, practicing beach landings again and again, sprinting through sand, dodging barbed wire, crawling under fire. They loaded into boats and jumped into cold water. They studied maps that showed not just cities and roads, but every farmhouse, hedgerow, and elevation. They learned how to use new equipment, radios, flamethrowers, explosives, compasses. They learned how to move in silence, how to find one another in the dark, how to stay alive in the chaos they knew was coming. In England's villages, locals watched as strangers filled their streets. Soldiers played cards in pubs, wrote letters in churchyards, and leaned on fences, staring at the cloudy skies. There was a tension beneath the quiet. Not fear exactly, but anticipation. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew exactly when. The preparations were immense. Roads were reinforced to carry tanks. Fields were turned into runways. Thousands of tons of supplies, bullets, bandages, rations, fuel, were packed into crates and loaded onto ships. Every detail was planned, down to the last moment. And then came the briefings. At last, the soldiers were told where they would go, what they would face, and why their mission mattered. For many, it was the first time they heard the name Normandy. They studied photographs taken from the sky, drawn maps, sand table models built to show every curve of the coastline. They learned about their landing zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Each one with its own challenges, its own dangers. They were told about the German defenses, the bunkers, the gun nests, the minefields. They were told to expect resistance, to expect confusion, to expect the worst. Still, they prepared. And then they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. In late May, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in over the channel. The seas became rough. The wind howled. Eisenhower, surrounded by forecasts and advisors, knew the decision could not be rushed. The invasion would require calm seas, clear skies, and a tide that would carry the landing craft to shore at just the right moment. If the weather turned, thousands could die before ever reaching the beach. The original date was set, the 5th of June, 1944. But the storms came. And so, as the waves pounded the southern coast of England and rain soaked the gear packed aboard the ships, the soldiers waited. Some wrote final letters. Some played cards, smoked cigarettes, stared at the sky. Others prayed. It was the kind of silence that only comes before something enormous. Then, just before dawn on June 5th, a brief break in the weather was spotted. A window, small, uncertain, but enough. Eisenhower paced the floor, hands behind his back. His commanders spoke quietly. Arguments passed in whispers. But finally, Eisenhower turned, faced his officers, and made the call. "We go," he said. And with those two words, history moved. Thousands of ships began to leave their harbors. Paratroopers gathered near their planes. Gliders were prepared. Rifles were checked. Letters sealed. Prayers whispered once more. The storm had not passed. Not fully. But there would be no more delays. D-Day was set.
The 6th of June, 1944. It would be the day the tide turned.
It would be the day they crossed the sea. Chapter 6. The eve of D-Day. Letters, prayers, and waiting. Night fell slowly on the 5th of June, 1944. Over southern England, the wind had settled into a whisper, and the skies, though still streaked with cloud, offered a fragile calm. In the distance, the sound of engines hummed like a restless tide. Across green fields and narrow country roads, a movement was underway, steady, solemn, quiet. This was not a night like any other. It was a night suspended between the world as it was and the world as it might become. In airfields, soldiers fastened parachute straps and checked their gear. Some stood in lines, waiting to board aircraft that would carry them over enemy lines. They carried rifles, maps, compasses, and letters. Some folded neatly in pockets. Others clutched tightly in shaking hands. In ports along the southern coast, landing craft sat in the dark, bobbing gently against docks, their decks weighed down by men, machines, and the tension of all they were about to face. The sea before them was black, unknowable, and waiting. Everywhere, in tents, in cabins, on decks, in cockpits, there was the same feeling. Something final, something sacred. Some soldiers wrote. The letters they composed were filled with hope, fear, and tenderness, addressed to mothers, sweethearts, fathers, brothers, children. They wrote of courage they were still trying to find, of promises they hoped to keep. Some tried to sound strong, others let tears stain the page. Most ended their letters with the same few words: "I love you." Some soldiers prayed, in small circles or alone, hands folded, eyes closed. Chaplains moved quietly among them, offering blessings, comfort, or simply presence. Not every man believed in God, but many found themselves reaching, in that moment, for something beyond themselves. Others said nothing at all. They sat in silence, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of their equipment, listening to the ticking of their watches, their thoughts unspoken, scattered like leaves in a storm. There were jokes, nervous ones, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes, a shared cigarette, a flask passed hand to hand. A soldier might talk about the girl he planned to marry, or the dog waiting back home, or the diner he'd visit again someday if he was lucky. In that long, suspended night, everyone waited in their own way, and overhead, the sky began to fill. Thousands of aircraft rose into the darkness. Bombers, transport planes, gliders. Inside them were paratroopers, sitting shoulder to shoulder, faces painted, hearts pounding. They had trained for this moment, rehearsed every landing, memorized every objective. But now it was real. They were airborne, bound for enemy territory, bound for Normandy. Below them, the sea stirred with ships. From tiny landing craft to mighty battleships, the invasion fleet was in motion. It was the largest armada the world had ever seen, and it stretched across the water like a moving city of steel and shadow. The men aboard these vessels could not yet see their destination. They could only hear the waves, the engine's low growl, and the creak of equipment strapped to their backs. Some tried to sleep. Others kept their eyes open, fixed on nothing, replaying orders in their minds. Time moved strangely that night. It was both fast and slow. It rushed forward with urgency, then dragged its feet with dread. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. On shore, in headquarters lit by lamps and low voices, commanders stared at maps. Eisenhower waited, quiet, smoking, writing a message he hoped he would never have to send. The one he would use if the invasion failed. But failure, though possible, was no longer allowed space. The machines were in motion. The course was set. In occupied France, villagers slept uneasily. They had grown used to the distant rumble of war, the curfews, the censored papers, the cold glances of German patrols. But tonight, something felt different. In the distance, the skies began to rumble, and before dawn, the wind carried the sound of parachutes opening like sighs in the dark.
And so the night passed, filled with motion, memory, and breath held tight in 1,000 throats.
At last, the horizon began to pale.
And with it came the day, the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day. Chapter 7, Before the Beach, Airborne Drops in the Night. Long before the sun touched the shores of Normandy, long before the first landing craft reached the sand, war had already arrived from above. It came in the hush of darkness, in the steady thrum of propellers and the low murmur of wind rushing past fuselages. It came with men sitting silently in the bellies of aircraft, knees brushing knees, rifles between their boots, breath fogging under painted faces. These were the airborne troops, paratroopers and glider-borne infantry, the first wave of the Allied invasion. Their mission was clear: land behind enemy lines under the cover of night, and take control of key positions before the seaborne forces arrived at dawn. Roads, bridges, causeways, villages. If they succeeded, the landings on the beaches would have a chance. If they failed, the men wading ashore at sunrise might face destruction. The aircraft formations were vast, waves of transports stretching from horizon to horizon. Inside them sat men from the United States 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and from the British 6th Airborne Division. They had trained for this. They had studied their drop zones. They had packed their gear in perfect order: knives, ammo, maps, field rations, compasses, morphine. Their hearts beat with a mixture of training and terror. The darkness below was thick and unknowable. Then, one by one, the red lights above the doors turned green. Jump! In bursts, they leapt into the sky, arms crossed over chests, legs tight, falling through blackness toward an unseen enemy. The night lit with flashes. From flak, from tracers, from the sharp bark of anti-aircraft guns below. Planes shuddered. Men were thrown off course. Some landed miles from their objectives. Some never made it to the ground at all. But still, they jumped, thousands of them, into hedgerows, marshes, rivers, and fields. The land beneath them was not forgiving. In the low-lying fields of Normandy, mist hung heavy. Cattle wandered near fences. Farmhouses stood still in the dark. German patrols, startled by the sudden descent, scrambled to react. Confusion reigned, both among defenders and attackers. Some paratroopers landed alone, far from their units. In the silence of a strange country, they moved like shadows, avoiding roads, listening for voices, searching for allies in a sea of fear. Others formed into small groups and pressed toward their objectives. Bridges were taken, gun positions assaulted, roads were blocked with debris, signals were sent with flares and torches, white cloths laid across fields, flickers of red, green, and yellow lighting the night in coded bursts. Meanwhile, the British 6th Airborne carried out a daring glider mission to capture key bridges over the River Orne. Their landing was precise, nearly on top of the objective, and they secured the bridges within minutes, holding them against counterattack through the long hours of darkness. In other parts of Normandy, the landings were less smooth. Flooded fields swallowed men and equipment. Some units were scattered across miles, others walked straight into enemy fire. But even in chaos, the mission pressed forward. French civilians, awakened by the strange music of war, looked out windows and saw parachutes tangled in trees, heard footsteps rushing down narrow lanes, watched strangers pass with weapons and purpose. Some hid, others emerged to help, guiding soldiers toward villages, whispering where German positions might be, offering bread, water, directions. As dawn approached, the first objectives were either taken, missed, or still fiercely contested. The paratroopers were bruised, scattered, and soaked, but they were on French soil. They had disrupted communication lines. They had confused the enemy. They had opened the door. Behind them, the sea churned with ships.
And soon, the second wave would arrive. Not from the sky, but from the surf.
The landings were about to begin. Chapter 8. The beaches of Normandy, dawn and desperation. As the first light of dawn broke over the waters of the English Channel, it revealed a sight not seen before in human history, a floating armada so vast, so powerful, and so silent in its purpose, that even the birds seemed to pause in the sky above it. Stretching from horizon to horizon were thousands of vessels, warships, transport ships, landing craft, and support boats. They moved steadily toward the coast of France, toward the German-occupied beaches of Normandy. On board were men, cold, wet, silent, their faces hardened by the long night, their minds heavy with what they were about to face. This was it, the beginning of the end. 5 beaches lay ahead, each with its own name, its own terrain, its own challenges. To the west was Utah, just to the east, Omaha, then Gold, Juno, and Sword. Americans would land at Utah and Omaha, the British at Gold and Sword, the Canadians at Juno. The sea was choppy. Some men leaned over the sides of their craft, seasick and sweating. Others clutched their rifles and stared ahead, eyes locked on the rising shoreline. Some whispered quiet prayers. Some remembered their families. All of them knew. This was not a drill. This was not training. This was the real thing. Ahead of them, the German defenses waited. For months, Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a line of bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, and artillery meant to repel any invasion from the sea. Machine gun nests peered down from cliffs. Concrete fortifications bristled with weapons. The sand was seeded with barbed wire, wooden stakes, and explosives. But the Allies were coming anyway. Before the landings began, the sky lit with thunder. Naval guns roared to life, hammering the coastline. Warships fired salvos into bunkers. Bombers rumbled overhead, dropping their payloads onto the fortifications. The earth shook. Smoke rose. And still the enemy waited. At last, the landing craft doors dropped, and the soldiers stepped forward into history. At Utah Beach, the landing went more smoothly than expected. Strong currents had pushed the American troops slightly off course. But by luck or grace, they found themselves in a less fortified section of the coast. Officers quickly adjusted their plans. Within hours, they had pushed inland, linking up with paratroopers who had dropped during the night. The casualties were fewer than feared. The beachhead was secure. But at Omaha, the story was different. The German defenses were strong, the terrain unforgiving. High bluffs overlooked the sand. The bombings had done little to weaken the enemy's position. As the first waves of Americans reached the shore, they met a storm of bullets and fire. Machine guns raked the water. Mortars exploded among the surf. Men fell before they reached dry land. Those who survived the initial landing took shelter behind obstacles. Tank traps, debris, the dead. They clawed forward inch by inch, dragging wounded comrades, calling for medics, pushing through fear. Officers rallied what men they could. Small groups crawled up the beach, using craters and smoke for cover. It was chaos, but slowly, painfully, miraculously, the line began to move. On Gold Beach, British forces encountered stiff resistance, but pushed forward with determination. They took villages, cleared bunkers, and advanced toward Bayeux. Their progress was methodical, well-planned, and determined. At Juno, the Canadians landed under heavy fire, but fought with ferocity. Their beach was flooded, the terrain rough, and the enemy alert. But they pressed forward, clearing paths, taking prisoners, and securing ground inch by inch. At Sword, the British again faced heavy opposition. The battle moved quickly inland, toward the city of Caen, where fighting would continue for weeks. But the beachhead was established. The invasion held. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The beaches were scarred, the sea ran red, the sand was filled with stories of bravery, fear, sacrifice, and survival. And though the cost was high, the foothold was secure. Europe had been breached. Chapter 9. Holding the Line. Courage beyond the sand. The beaches were behind them now, but the hardest part was still ahead. By the evening of the 6th of June, the Allied forces had carved a narrow path into occupied France. 5 beaches, once silent under the rising sun, now echoed with the sounds of wounded men, rolling tanks, shouted orders, and hurried prayers. But the land beyond those beaches was not empty. It was a maze of hedgerows, narrow roads, hidden gun emplacements, and towns still under German control. And as the light faded on that longest day, the next phase of the battle began. The goal was simple: hold the line. But holding the line meant much more than digging in. It meant pushing inland, linking the 5 beachheads into one continuous front. It meant fending off counterattacks. It meant surviving not just bullets and bombs, but exhaustion, rain, confusion, and grief. In the days that followed D-Day, the men who had landed on the beaches found themselves in a new kind of war, one not of open confrontation, but of close-quarters struggle. Normandy was not flat. It was a countryside of small fields, each bordered by thick hedgerows, high, leafy walls of earth and growth that shielded both movement and danger. Soldiers called it the bocage, and in the bocage, you never saw the enemy until he was firing. Fighting moved slowly. Every field had to be cleared. Every farm had to be checked. German soldiers, well-trained and well-hidden, defended from stone barns, church towers, and forest lines. The Allies had air superiority, but it was little help against snipers hiding in haylofts or machine gunners dug into hedgerows. Still, the advance continued. American forces pushed west and south from Utah and Omaha, aiming to link with the British and Canadians moving from Gold, Juno, and Sword. They fought through towns with names they had never heard before: Carentan, Sainte-Mère-Église, Villers-Bocage. Each village was a new battlefield, each crossroad a vital link, and in every direction danger waited. Supplies were rushed ashore. Engineers built makeshift ports from floating platforms. Fuel, ammunition, food, and water poured into Normandy through lines of vehicles and by hand. The logistics alone were staggering. A machine of movement and planning, just as important as the soldiers carrying rifles at the front. And all the while, the Germans struck back. Panzer divisions, Germany's armored fist, were ordered to the front. Some were delayed by the confusion sown by the airborne landings. Others had been held in Calais, still convinced that the main invasion was coming there. But by the second week, they began arriving in force. The fighting grew more brutal. In hedgerows, tanks could barely maneuver. Infantry advanced yard by yard. Machine gun fire could erupt from any corner. And at night, the shadows were thick with movement, some friendly, some not. In the town of Caen, the British faced a fierce and drawn-out battle. What had been hoped as a day's objective became a weeks-long siege. The city, with its medieval stone streets and narrow alleys, turned into a fortress. Bombing raids softened German positions, but also shattered civilian homes. The cost was high for soldiers and for the people who had lived in Caen before war turned it into rubble. And yet, amid all the horror, there was light. French civilians, terrified and displaced, helped however they could. Some opened their homes to Allied soldiers. Others served as guides, pointed toward enemy positions, or offered food to the wounded. Children peeked from behind ruined walls, holding the hands of grandmothers, unsure if they should smile. There were moments of heroism, small and quiet. A medic crawling through gunfire to save a friend. A squad holding a farmhouse for 12 hours against repeated attack. A lone radio operator calling in air support as tanks advanced on his position. Courage did not always look like glory. Sometimes it looked like endurance, like taking one more step when your legs trembled, like helping someone up when you were barely standing yourself. For the Allies, holding the line in Normandy meant more than just surviving. It meant proving that the beachhead was not a lucky break, but the beginning of something unstoppable. By the end of June, the 5 separate landings had become one united front. The Allies held a solid strip of coastal France. The push inland would continue. The liberation of Paris was still months away. The fall of Berlin would take nearly a year. But the line held, and with every mile reclaimed, the world inched closer to freedom. Chapter 10. Echoes of June 6th. The legacy of D-Day. The morning of June 6th, 1944, has long since passed. The chaos and courage that once defined those hours have faded into grainy photographs, cracked letters, and the hushed recollections of men now old and frail. But D-Day is not just a chapter in a textbook. It is a story still breathing, still echoing through time. Not merely a military operation, it was a reckoning, an unflinching commitment to liberation, an act of hope in a world dragged through despair. As the decades roll on, the beaches of Normandy remain. They are no longer torn by explosions or scarred by tank treads. Today, they rest beneath skies that drift with sea air and gentle sun. Children build sandcastles where craters once marked the passage of shells. Wildflowers grow where machine guns once opened fire. But beneath that calm, the earth remembers. The land still holds the weight of history. To walk those beaches now is to walk through layers of time. One sees the shorelines not only as they are, but as they were. Omaha, where the tide ran red. Utah, where fortune offered a gentler landing. Gold, Juno, and sword, each with their own legacy of struggle and bravery. Every grain of sand carries memory. Those memories belong first and foremost to the men who lived them, the soldiers who stepped into the surf with rifles held high and hearts pounding. Most had never seen combat before. Many had never seen the ocean. Some were barely out of school. Yet when the ramp dropped, they moved forward, not out of fear, but out of purpose. They advanced under fire, across open beaches, up cliffs, into nests of barbed wire and concrete, because they believed they must. That belief was not abstract. It was born of something deep and clear. That tyranny cannot be allowed to spread unchecked. That the world had already seen too much, suffered too long. The ghettos, the camps, the burning cities, the broken promises. Europe had been dragged into shadow, and on June 6th, the light returned, not all at once, not without cost, but undeniably. For the people of occupied France, D-Day was both miracle and terror. The sound of planes and artillery announced the beginning of the end. In towns near the coast, families took shelter as battles raged nearby. Some had already aided the resistance, risking everything to sabotage German lines, shelter downed pilots, and pass secret messages. Others had waited silently, hoping to survive long enough to see a day like this. And when the Allied troops arrived, dusty and foreign and brave, many French civilians wept openly. They came out of their homes waving cloth flags, offering bread, wine, anything they could find. They whispered thanks. They pointed toward enemy positions. They held the hands of wounded strangers. Liberation was not a word. It was a feeling. It was the sudden rush of breath after years spent holding it in. The cost was staggering. By the end of that first day, thousands were dead, thousands more wounded. But the line held. The beachheads connected. The bridgehead was secured. And with it, the march toward the heart of Nazi Germany had begun. The road would be long, filled with setbacks and sorrow. But the first step had been taken. In the years that followed, the veterans of D-Day returned home. Some found peace. Some struggled. Some built families and careers. Others were haunted by the faces they could not forget. They rarely spoke of it. When they did, it was often quiet, matter of fact. But their eyes told the rest. They had seen something unthinkable, and they had endured. Yet they never called themselves heroes. To them, the heroes were the ones who never came back, the ones who now rest beneath rows of crosses and stars, in soil far from home, the ones who never saw the world they helped rebuild, the silent sentinels of freedom. Today, visitors come from all over the world to stand among those markers, to read the names, to wonder about the lives behind them. Children walk between the rows, asking questions their parents sometimes cannot answer. Flags are left, flowers are placed. And in those quiet moments, something profound happens. Remembrance becomes a bridge between past and present, between the living and the lost. And this is where we begin to understand the true legacy of D-Day. It is not found only in the military outcome, in the fall of a regime, or the redrawing of borders. It is found in the enduring idea that ordinary people, when united by purpose, can do extraordinary things. That even in the face of overwhelming darkness, light can break through. It is found in the stories still told at kitchen tables, in schoolrooms, in whispered prayers. It is found in the silence that falls when a bugle plays taps, or when a veteran salutes a grave. It is found in the resolve of generations who came after, vowing to remember, to honor, and to never let the lessons of that day fade. Chapter 10. Echoes of June 6th. The Legacy of D-Day, Part 2. The story of D-Day did not end with the last shot fired in Normandy. Its echoes rippled across time, shaping not just the final year of the Second World War, but the moral and political fabric of the decades that followed. It reminded the world of the necessity of unity, the weight of sacrifice, and the cost of silence in the face of evil. After the beaches were secured and the hedgerows cleared, the Allied forces continued their slow push eastward. Cities were liberated. Camps were discovered. The horrors the world had only guessed at were laid bare, evidence of what had been at stake. D-Day had not just opened a military front, it had torn the veil off a continent's suffering. As Nazi Germany fell and peace returned, D-Day became something more than a battlefield victory. It became a benchmark, a moral compass, a point of reference in every conversation about freedom, justice, and responsibility. Leaders would invoke it. Veterans would protect it. Artists, poets, and filmmakers would try to capture its meaning. And yet, no painting, no book, no speech could ever quite contain the full truth of what happened that day. But perhaps the truest tribute is not found in monuments or medals. It is found in the choices made afterward, in the formation of alliances meant to prevent another world war, in the international agreements drafted to protect human rights, in the quiet decisions of individuals inspired by the memory of D-Day, to stand up when they see something wrong, to defend those who cannot defend themselves. The men who landed in Normandy were not flawless. They were not immune to fear. They were not invincible. But they were willing to fight, to bleed, and, if necessary, to fall, so that others might rise. That willingness is rare and precious. Over the decades, the memory of D-Day has been kept alive not just by ceremonies, but by the ongoing commitment to learn from the past. Schools teach it. Families visit the beaches. Films try to make it real for new generations. And each June, as the date returns, people gather in silence, listening to the waves, honoring the courage that crossed them. And that legacy matters, because each time we remember D-Day, we remember what is possible when nations set aside differences to stand for something larger than themselves. We remember that freedom is not given, but earned and defended. We remember that the world we live in, with all its imperfections, was built on the shoulders of those who gave everything on the beaches of Normandy. As the last veterans pass from this world, it falls to us to carry their story, to not just retell it, but to live in a way that honors it. to recognize that their sacrifice gave us more than peace. It gave us responsibility. So as we close this journey, let the story of D-Day remain with you, not just as history, but as a call, a whisper through time that says, when the world needs courage, it can be found. That when darkness gathers, light will rise. That even the greatest storms can be crossed if we do it together. D-Day was not the end, it was a beginning. The story of D-Day did not end with the final shot fired on the beaches of Normandy. It did not close with the last soldier to find cover among the hedgerows, or the final tank to roll inland. Instead, the true legacy of D-Day rippled far beyond the coastal towns of France. It moved outward, across the world, and forward, across time. When the war came to an end in 1945, the men who had survived the landings returned home. Some found parades and cheering crowds. Others found quiet streets and an eerie stillness, the kind that comes after a storm. They carried with them more than medals and scars. They carried memories of friends who did not return, of terror and triumph, of a single day that split their lives in two. Many tried to put that day behind them. They went to college, married, built homes, raised children, but deep within, D-Day remained, sometimes in words, more often in silence. It was in the way they looked out over a field at sunset, in the way they paused during the national anthem, in the way they stood just a little straighter when the calendar turned to June. For the world, D-Day became a symbol, not only of military strength, but of moral clarity. It stood as proof that when evil grows too large, there will be those who rise to meet it. It became a beacon for later generations who would face their own battles, some in war, others in struggles for justice, for civil rights, for peace. The memory of that day shaped how nations rebuilt. It guided the formation of the United Nations, inspired new treaties and alliances, and created a shared sense that never again could the world look away when tyranny rose. Every June 6th, the beaches come alive again, not with violence, but with memory. Veterans return, their numbers fewer each year, their steps slower, but their eyes are sharp, their memories intact. Children approach them, sometimes shy, sometimes curious, and the old soldiers smile, not because they wish to relive the past, but because they see the future in front of them, a future their sacrifice helped protect. Across the green fields above Omaha and Utah, above Juneau and Sword and Gold, white markers stretch in perfect lines, crosses and stars, each one a name, a life, a promise kept. The grass grows around them, the ocean sings just beyond, and the wind carries the stories forward, not only for those who were lost, but for those who still remember. The legacy of D-Day is not only in what was destroyed, a regime, an occupation, a war. It is in what was preserved, hope, freedom, the right to choose one's own path. It reminds us that peace is not passive. It is built, defended, and, most of all, remembered. And so, we honor them, not just with monuments or days off, but with our actions. with how we treat one another, with how we stand up for what's right, with how we remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. D-Day was not just the beginning of the end of the war. It was the beginning of a long road toward a better world, a road we are still walking today.